250 miles north of Thule lies another relic of the Cold War, an almost intact B-29 bomber.
Buried deep inside an Arctic iceberg, a World War II plane sat untouched for decades. When a survey team spotted the metal shape under the ice, they expected scraps from an old crash. Instead, they uncovered a fully preserved aircraft locked in place like it hadn't aged at all. The real shock came when they opened the hatch. Gear, notes, and items that should have disappeared long ago were still there, frozen in perfect detail. What was inside shocked everyone. Imagine being a researcher going through the vast, frozen wastelands of Greenland and spotting what looks like a jagged chunk of metal embedded in an iceberg. That's exactly what explorers saw in the early 1990s. Only what they initially thought was glacial debris turned out to be a lost piece of World War II history. This was Glacier Girl, a Lockheed P-38 Lightning fighter that had been swallowed whole by the ice. Back in July 1942, while the Second World War was still at its most tense moment, a squadron was carrying 6 P-38 fighters and 2 B-17 bombers while trying to cross from the US to Great Britain through Greenland and Iceland. But the weather did not allow them to pass. Miraculously, all the airmen survived, but their planes didn't, and they thought they would never see them again. Over decades, the ice crept upward, burying the planes over an ever-growing glacier. By the 1980s and early 1990s, they had drifted far from their original landing spot. These planes were lost to time and climate. But when some aviation enthusiasts and historians decided to find out if they could ever find these planes, no one would have imagined that they would achieve their goal. After years of digging, what emerged from that frozen rewrote what many knew about what ice, time, and preservation could do. This was done in early 1980s, when a pair of aviation-obsessed entrepreneurs, Pat Epps and Richard Taylor, refused to let that story end on ice. In 1981, they co-founded the Greenland Expedition Society with the dream of locating the buried fleet, which many call the Lost Squadron. They believed that some of the aircraft might still be sitting under the glacier, waiting to be discovered. They even assumed that the tails might be sticking out of the snow. Well, it would surprise you how right yet how wrong they were. Although the planes were still there, many of them had melted into the belly of the ice cap. Over the many years, Epps, Taylor, and their dedicated team launched expedition after expedition, exploring the entire region to find traces of the plane. It wasn't as easy as it might seem, but after years and support, they eventually achieved their goal. When they finally got Glacier Girl out of the ice, they decided to look inside, and you won't believe what they found. When the crew who recovered Glacier Girl finally cracked open her icy tomb in 1992, what they discovered was something miraculous, as if the glacier had pressed pause on time. Beneath 268 feet of compacted ice and snow, they found the World War II-era Lockheed P-38 Lightning, and its fuselage, engines, and propeller had survived. Even more astonishing, many of the internal components, from the cockpit instruments to the structural elements, remain intact and seemed frozen in the moment the plane was abandoned. Although the cockpit dials, gauges, operational controls, and even original wiring had aged and were showing signs of time, they were still present and offered a complete view of the 1940s warbird ready for flight. The very design of the P-38, including the feathered propellers, had helped the plane defy the crushed weight of the ice, making extraction prospects realistic. They found the pilot's personal effects right in the cockpit. Before he departed the crash site in 1942, the pilot, Lieutenant Harry L. Smith, removed his helmet and parachute but left some items behind. In his journal, he wrote about the details of the landing and mentioned that he threw the canopy keys inside the cockpit before he left the plane. This was found in the plane, but another pilot, Lieutenant Brad McManus, had taken his clock as a keepsake for his own plane. That shows that they might have left some items behind only for their personal use. They also found other types of personal items, like flight gear, oxygen masks, leather seat straps, food rations, logbooks, and small personal effects. These items gave us a view into the lives of the young soldiers and aviators that were forced down in one of the harshest environments on Earth. What's more, the aircraft's built-in weaponry was found intact and preserved by the ice. This included 4.50 caliber Browning machine guns and 120mm Hispano A&M 2C cannon. The original ammunition was also still on the plane. The airplane that they found was more like a time capsule, and it showed that the level of preservation under half a century of sub-zero conditions was remarkable. Glacier Girl was the only lucky plane that found itself enveloped in an ice cave and safe, unlike the other planes which were found nearby and had been crushed by massive icebergs. In fact, it was so surprising that the Glacier Girl plane still had air in its tires. The ice had also frozen the tires in place, and they could still work after all the decades. But the fact that Glacier Girl found itself frozen in a remote Greenland ice cap for many decades is surprising, but the story that left it abandoned is as interesting as it is shocking. In the summer of 1942, during Operation Bolero, the massive Allied forces made efforts to ferry combat aircraft from the United States to Britain over the North Atlantic. So, a squadron of US aircraft set out for Europe. Among them were 6 twin-engine fighters of the 94th Fighter Squadron, called P-38 Lightnings, and 2 B-17 bombers. On the 15th of July, they attempted a part of their journey, going from a base on Greenland's west coast toward Iceland and onward to the United Kingdom. As the flight advanced over the Denmark Strait, the weather deteriorated catastrophically. There was heavy overcast, poor visibility, freezing temperatures, and ice forming on windscreens. The pilots found themselves flying through a wall of cloud that stretched upward tens of thousands of feet. And at high altitude, the cold dropped dramatically, making conditions dangerous. They could barely see, and if they kept moving, it could be dangerous. Navigation under these circumstances was very tough. At those northern latitudes, compass navigation is notoriously unreliable. They were dealing with limited visibility, no reliable landmarks, and deteriorating weather, causing their flight to lose its bearings. On top of disorientation, the planes were running low on fuel. With no safe airstrip in sight, and there was a little chance of reaching friendly territory, the only option was to land in the middle of nowhere. This decision led to what we know as one of the largest forced landings in US military history. The crews circled until they found what little clear ice they could, and then with their landing gear retracted, they made belly landings on the ice cap. The first P-38 to touch down attempted a gear down landing but flipped over when its nose wheel caught a snowdrift. The other skid to a halt in wheels-up positions. Despite their violent landing, none of the crew died or were even injured. The airmen were stranded on the frozen ice field more than 10 miles from the coast and south of the Arctic Circle, and they had to endure the subarctic conditions for days. They survived on emergency rations, gear, and in one case, even a case of clandestine whiskey until a rescue party which used sleds, retrieved them after about 11 days. There was no way to retrieve the planes and no feasible plan to bring them out, so the aircraft were abandoned where they lay and the soldiers were rescued. Over the decades, snow accumulated as you can expect for that region. The Greenland ice cap was cold, stable, and with layers building year after year, gradually buried the plains. Over time, shifting and compacting snow turned to solid ice and engulfed the wrecks. By the time anyone remembered to search for the lost planes, the ice cap had swallowed them under roughly 268 feet of glacial buildup. When the Greenland Expedition Society decided to find the plane, they found themselves facing roadblocks after roadblocks. They went many years and couldn't find anything, even as they combined historical research, analysis of old photos, and the latest subsurface sensing technology together. They even used ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry to narrow down where the lost aircraft might have found itself after more than 2 centuries of snowfall. Well, a decade after looking, they finally found a breakthrough. In 1992, after more than a decade of failed attempts, false leads, and freezing disappointment, a small and determined team achieved what many believed was impossible. They were looking to recover the Glacier Girl, and someone was finally ready to help them. In 1992, a Kentucky businessman, Roy Schaffner, decided to invest in the movement from GES, and this gave them all that they needed to make a final and successful expedition. He provided the funding that had eluded earlier efforts. The mission was led on the ground by project manager Bob Cardin, who marshaled a resolute crew that was prepared to endure the Arctic's unforgiving environment. They were exhausted from staying in the cold and isolated. Locating the aircraft under more than 260 feet of ice was not a simple feat. Over the previous years, the recovery team had refined their search by combining historical photos, knowledge of glacial flow, and modern subsurface sensing technologies such as ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry. These advancements allowed them to finally pinpoint where the squadron might have been buried after years of false starts. Once they had finally found the Glacier Girl on Greenland's ice cap, the team faced another problem that they might have expected. They had to reach the plane, which was over 250 feet under them, covered with ice. Their solution was a new invention, as they made a device called the Super Gopher. It was a thermal meltdown generator, but then the Gopher was designed to melt a narrow, 4-foot-wide shaft through the ice by circulating hot water pumped through copper tubing coiled around the outside. The Gopher was gradually lowered by a hoist at a rate of about 2 to 4 feet per hour, so it took them another month to reach the plane. Once the shaft was complete, the workers also went underground. It took them about 25 minutes to get to the depths and see the plane. Then, they carved out a cavern around the aircraft using steam hoses and careful chiseling. They also pumped out the meltwater constantly to avoid any dripping or shifting ice. But there was a final challenge, which was disassembling the plane that was inside a cramped, damp ice cavern and hauling section after section up to the surface. After months of grueling labor in frozen conditions, on August 1st, 1992, the final and heaviest section, which was a 17-long-foot center fuselage, finally emerged from its 50-year slumber under ice. After many years, they had finally reached into the frozen wasteland and pulled out a World War II warbird from the grave of Greenland. Even more surprising, the plane was pulled out with its structure intact, and it was preserved well enough to allow full restoration. The expedition team didn't just want to salvage metal scrap, And the many years they used to get the plane out was just the start. The second step was to finally restore the World War II plane to its former glory. When Glacier Girl emerged from decades of entombment in Greenland ice and was finally transported to Middlesboro, Kentucky, it entered a new chapter of restoration and rebirth. In 1992, the aircraft had been pulled from nearly 270 feet of glacial ice by members of Greenland Expedition Society, and soon after, with the financial backing of a Kentucky businessman. When the stripped-down fuselage arrived at Schaffner's hangar, the restoration team, led by restoration manager Bob Carden, faced the sobering truth. Nearly every component had been damaged by decades under ice. The bolts, rivets, cockpit fittings, and skin panels still existed and looked intact, but they were in no way airworthy. In fact, they realized that they knew little about P-38s, since these were planes from the Second World War. Despite the challenges, the condition of the plane was unusually hopeful. Most of the original structure, like the engines, propellers, guns, and airframe, was still intact. It had been immersed in ice for half a century and actually survived with remarkable preservation. Just like it took over a decade for them to find the plane, they used the same time to restore it back to its glory. Over that time, mechanics and volunteers labored carefully. They had to manufacture the replacement parts for those that were beyond salvage, because this was a plane from the 1940s, and at the same time, they preserved as much of the original components as possible. After all the years, they finally restored and managed to retain about 80% of the original plane. That means they only replaced about 20% of the parts on the Glacier Girl. It's an impressive proof of how staying under ice literally kept the P-38 plane frozen in time. By early September 2002, they had achieved something else. The engines of the plane roared back to life again, and they finally knew that the plane could fly again. Then, on October 26, 2002, Glacier Girl flew once more after spending over 4 decades frozen in ice. A crowd of some 20,000 people gathered at the small Middlesboro airfield to witness the moment. With engines running, landing gear checked, and the familiar silhouette lifting skyward, the decades-lost warbird returned to the air as if time had rolled back nearly 60 years. Then, on June 22, 2007, Glacier Girl departed Teterboro Airport, New Jersey, in an attempt to fly across the Atlantic Ocean to Duxford, England. The plan was to complete the flight that had started 65 years earlier, but it didn't work out because there was a coolant leak in the right engine, causing it to be grounded in Goose Bay, Labrador. After about a month, they repaired the plane again, installing 2 overhauled Allison engines. It then returned to the US, and they realized that although it had been restored, it could only take short trips, like during air shows. Of all P-38s ever built, over 10,000 during World War II, only a few survive today, and far fewer are airworthy. Glacier Girl rapidly became regarded as one of the finest warbird restorations in existence, often celebrated for the extraordinary feat of resurrecting a combat-age fighter from a glacier's grip. In fact, they have found other P-38s and tried to recover and restore them, but were not as successful as with Glacier Girl. The dramatic resurrection of Glacier Girl in 1992 wasn't the end for the search of the lost squadron. In the decades since that happened, aviation history enthusiasts have constantly tried to recover more of the P-38 Lightnings buried beneath Greenland's ice. One of these is the quest to retrieve P-38 Echo, which many say is the strongest candidate for a second recovery. The renewed campaign gained publicity in April 2016, when a group of explorers, led by entrepreneurs Ken McBride and Jim Salazar, under the guidance of veteran pilot explorer Ron Sheardown, announced plans to extract another P-38 between May and August of the year. The Echo was flown by Robert H. Wilson in 1942, and they believed that it might still be in reach. So, over the next several years, the team faced the same challenges that had defeated the earlier crews, like those who found Glacier Girl. They had to deal with the Arctic environment, shifting ice, unpredictable weather, and the dangerous unstable area where the wrecks had drifted. But things became hopeful in 2018. Using modern survey methods like drones equipped with ground-penetrating radar, the team announced they had located Echo roughly 340 feet beneath the surface. They used a heated probe to carry out a test, and it came out coated in hydraulic fluid, so they knew that the buried aircraft was right there. It took a shorter time to find Echo than it did to find Glacier Girl, but there was another problem. Extracting the plane seems to be even more complex than locating it in the first place. The plan outlined by the team involved melting a shaft through the ice, similar in principle to the method used to recover Glacier Girl, then carving out a cavern around the wreck, dismantling the aircraft in situ, and hoisting the parts to the surface piece by piece. Yet as of May 2025, Echo remains entombed. A combination of logistical hurdles, harsh Greenland weather, and shifting ice, which has reportedly moved the site by over 100 meters since 2018, has prevented a full-scale excavation. The team recently confirmed that their planned 2025 expedition will attempt to relocate and extract Echo, weather and conditions permitting. But the Echo isn't the only other P-38 from the original 1942 crash site still buried in that vast Arctic glacier. Several other fighters are missing, and 2 B-17 bombers, but it might be hard to recover them when you look at the extreme pressure and degradation inflicted by decades under ice. When the World War II plane was found frozen in the Greenland ice cap after years of being abandoned, the experts and scientists couldn't believe that they would find it in perfect condition. Every single component was working perfectly, and it was like it was frozen in time. What do you think is the most shocking aspect of this discovery? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. So, thanks for watching this video, and we will see you in the next one.